Picture a country where the refrigerators don't work, the stores are empty, and somehow people are still eating dinner every night. That's not a riddle. That actually happened in Cuba in the 1990s. Soviet aid vanished overnight, and the entire economy should have collapsed. It didn't collapse completely, because millions of ordinary people quietly broke the rules of their own system just to survive. They grew vegetables on apartment balconies. They ran black market trades for spare parts. They fixed 40-year-old cars with wire and stubbornness. And that single detail tells you almost everything you need to know about the capitalism versus socialism debate. Except nobody ever frames it this way. Because the real story isn't about which system is morally superior. It's about what humans do the instant a system tells them no, and reality tells them you still have to eat. I'm not here to tell you capitalism is good or socialism is evil, or the reverse. Because honestly, that argument has been running for over 100 years. And it still hasn't produced a winner anyone fully believes in. What I want to show you instead is something stranger and more useful. Every time either system got strict about its own rules, people found a way around them, and that workaround is usually where the real economy was hiding all along. Let's start somewhere. Most people skip entirely. East Germany. Decades into a fully planned, fully socialist economy. If you wanted a car in East Germany, you didn't go to a dealership. You put your name on a waiting list. And then you waited, on average, for over a decade. For a Trabant, a car made largely of recycled cotton fiber pressed into plastic resin, steel was rationed for more important uses. People joked that you ordered your Trabant for your newborn child, so it would arrive roughly around the time that child learned to drive. That's not a story about a bad car. That's a story about a system so committed to controlling outcomes that it forgot to ask what anyone actually wanted. Central planners in Berlin and Moscow were trying to solve an impossible math problem. Guess the needs of millions of households years in advance without letting prices tell them anything. Prices, in a market, are basically millions of tiny messages being sent every second. This wants to be more expensive. That wants to be cheaper. Build more of this. Stop making that. Strip prices out of an economy, and you haven't removed the chaos. You've just removed your ability to see it coming. That's the part the planners in Moscow underestimated. And it's the part most retellings of this story underestimate too. Now flip to the opposite extreme. Let's go somewhere most documentaries never mention. Argentina, again and again, decade after decade. Argentina has run through more currency collapses than almost any country on earth. And it did this not under socialism, but under cycles of market-friendly, capital-driven policy that kept overheating and bursting. In 2001, Argentinians watched their savings get frozen in banks overnight. Inflation tore through their wages, and entire neighborhoods turned to bartering, trading skills, and goods directly, because the official currency had basically stopped meaning anything. Notice the pattern. In Cuba, socialism failed people, and they built underground markets. In Argentina, market capitalism failed people, and they built underground markets. Two completely different ideologies. And in both cases, the same instinct kicked in. When the official system breaks, humans build an unofficial one almost immediately, using whatever's lying around. That instinct is the thing economists argue about constantly, but rarely name directly. Some call it self-interest, some call it resilience. I'd call it something simpler. People don't wait for permission to solve their own problems. And that single fact is the real reason both pure capitalism and pure socialism have never survived contact with reality for very long. Pure capitalism assumes that if you simply remove restrictions, the market will self-correct into fairness. History keeps proving that wrong, because concentrated wealth buys influence, and influence rewrites the rules in its own favor. Pure socialism assumes that if you simply remove ownership, people will work for the collective good without needing personal reward. History keeps proving that wrong too. Removing reward doesn't make people more generous. It usually just makes them quietly do less. So both systems, in their purest form, are betting against the same thing. Human nature doesn't switch off just because an ideology asked it to. Here's where it gets genuinely interesting, though. There's a quieter story that almost never makes it into these debates. The Mondragon Corporation, in the Basque region of Spain. Mondragon is a massive network of worker-owned cooperatives, founded in the 1950s. Today, it employs tens of thousands of people across manufacturing, finance, and retail. The workers aren't just employees, they're literal owners. They vote on major decisions, share profits, and cap the pay gap between top executives and the lowest paid worker far tighter than almost any normal corporation would allow. It's not socialism in the state control sense, and it's not capitalism in the shareholder sense. It's something else entirely, a hybrid built from the ground up rather than imposed from a government office. And it has survived, profitably, for over 70 years. Through recessions that crushed plenty of traditional companies around it. Why does this matter? Because it proves the debate was never really capitalism versus socialism, as two sealed boxes you have to choose between. It was always about ownership, incentive, and accountability. And those three ingredients can be mixed in far more combinations than the loud political voices ever admit. Before we get to the next case, let's pause on a question that probably just crossed your mind. If pure systems keep failing, why does anyone keep trying them in their pure form at all? The honest answer is that pure systems are seductive precisely because they're simple. And simple stories are easier to sell to a frightened population than complicated ones. Tell someone, the rich are stealing from you, seize the factories. You've given them a villain and a solution in one sentence. Tell someone, deregulate everything and the market will sort it out. You've given them the same gift, a villain, government interference, and a clean fix. Both pitches work because they remove the hardest part of running a country, which is admitting that the answer is usually, it depends, and we'll have to keep adjusting. Nobody wins an election promising constant, boring recalibration. People win elections promising certainty. And that gap between what wins elections and what actually works is where a huge amount of economic damage gets done. You can see that gap most clearly in Chile in the 1970s and 80s, a case most people only half remember. After military government took power, it brought in economists trained at the University of Chicago. They applied an extreme version of free market capitalism almost overnight, privatizing pensions, slashing tariffs, deregulating industries at a speed almost no democracy could have survived politically. For a while, inflation came down and certain sectors grew fast. The experiment got held up internationally as proof that shock therapy capitalism works. But underneath the headline numbers, inequality widened sharply. Unemployment spiked before it ever fell. And decades later, Chileans were still protesting over privatized pensions and water rights that left ordinary families exposed in ways the textbook never mentioned. The lesson wasn't that markets don't work. The lesson was that markets imposed without consent, without safety nets, and without listening to the people living inside them, generate resentment that doesn't disappear. It just waits. Now go to the opposite move, in a country most people only think about because of one mineral, Bolivia and its lithium reserves. Bolivia sits on one of the largest lithium deposits on the planet. It's the metal every electric car battery on Earth needs. And the government chose deliberately not to hand it over to foreign capital the way many resource-rich nations have. Instead, it pursued state-controlled development, insisting that profits and processing stay domestic, betting that ownership itself was the path to lasting prosperity for ordinary Bolivians. The results have been slow, technically difficult, and politically messy. Proof that state control of a resource doesn't automatically translate into competent execution. But it's also a direct rebuttal to the idea that the only path to development is foreign capital extracting your resources while you collect royalties. Put Chile and Bolivia side by side and you get a strange mirror. One country let markets run too fast without protection. The other slowed markets down to protect sovereignty. And both are still arguing internally about whether they got the balance right. That's not a tidy story with a clear winner. And honestly, that's exactly the point. Now let's go somewhere that quietly ran one of the most successful economic transitions on Earth. Almost nobody outside the region talks about it, Vietnam. In the 1980s, Vietnam was a textbook centrally planned socialist economy, recovering from decades of war with chronic food shortages and an economy that simply could not produce enough to feed its own population. Instead of collapsing like the Soviet Union eventually did, Vietnam's leadership launched a set of reforms called Doi Moi in 1986. The word loosely translates to renovation. They kept the Communist Party firmly in political control, but they opened the door to private enterprise, foreign investment, and market pricing in agriculture and industry. Farmers who once handed everything to the state were suddenly allowed to sell surplus rice on the open market. Production didn't just improve, it transformed the country from a rice importer into one of the largest rice exporters on the planet within a few years. Vietnam never called this capitalism. It still doesn't. But functionally, it borrowed capitalism's incentive structure while keeping socialism's political architecture fully intact. Decades later, Vietnam is one of the fastest growing economies in Asia, manufacturing everything from sneakers to smartphones while still officially governed by a single socialist party. If East Germany shows you what happens when a planned economy refuses to bend, Vietnam shows you the opposite. What happens when one bends just enough to survive without breaking its political core. That distinction, bending without breaking, might be the single most underrated skill in economic history. And almost no ideology teaches it, because ideologies are built to be defended, not adjusted. Let's talk about one more place, because I think it might be the most underrated case study in the entire conversation. Singapore. Singapore runs an aggressively open, foreign investment-friendly capitalist economy. Low taxes, minimal red tape, global trade at the center of everything. But the government also owns enormous stakes in major industries through state investment funds. It builds the vast majority of housing directly through public programs, and it mandates personal savings accounts that fund healthcare and retirement for every citizen. It's a place where you can start a business in an afternoon. And also live in a government-built apartment you actually own, funded partly by a national savings system the government designed. Singapore took the parts of capitalism that generate growth and the parts of socialism that prevent people from falling through the floor, and welded them together without much concern for ideological purity. The result is one of the highest standards of living on the planet, built by a government that simply refused to treat free market and public ownership as enemies. So here's the uncomfortable pattern emerging across every single example we've looked at. Cuba, East Germany, Argentina, Mondragon, Singapore. The places that actually function long-term are the ones that stopped treating this as a binary choice. The ones that suffered the worst, lasting damage, are the ones that committed hardest to the pure version of either ideology, and refused to adjust when reality pushed back. East Germany refused to let prices do their job until the system buckled under its own blindness. Argentina refused to build lasting institutional trust in its currency until citizens stopped believing in money itself. Meanwhile, Mondragon and Singapore, two wildly different places with almost nothing in common culturally, both succeeded the same way, by blending ownership models instead of picking a side and defending it religiously. This is why I think the entire framing of capitalism versus socialism is, frankly, a little bit of a trap. It invites you to defend a team the way you'd defend a sports club, instead of asking the only question that actually matters. In this specific situation, with these specific people, what combination of incentive and protection produces the best outcome? That question doesn't trend on social media. It doesn't fit on a flag. It doesn't give you a chant to shout at a rally. But it's the question every successful economy has quietly been answering for decades, regardless of what they call themselves on paper. China brands itself socialist while running some of the most aggressive private capital markets on earth. The United States brands itself capitalist while running Social Security, public schools, and deposit insurance, things that would have sounded suspiciously socialist to a 19th century banker. Norway brands itself a thriving capitalist democracy, while owning its oil industry through a sovereign fund worth well over $1 trillion, collectively held for every citizen. And then there's Estonia, a tiny former Soviet republic. After independence, it didn't just adopt capitalism, it digitized almost the entire relationship between citizen and state. You can start a company online in 15 minutes and file taxes in under 5. You can vote, bank, and access medical records through a single secure digital identity, all while the country runs a genuinely open, low-tax, pro-business economy. What's striking is that Estonia used cutting-edge digital infrastructure, something you'd associate with bold public investment, to make capitalism faster and friendlier, not to replace it. It's a reminder that the tools of big government and the goals of free markets aren't actually opposites. They're just ingredients. And Estonia simply mixed them well. None of these countries are pure anything. They're all running on blends, adjusting the recipe slightly every decade as circumstances change. And maybe that's the actual lesson hiding underneath 100 years of arguing. Ideology is a starting sketch, not a finished blueprint. The sketch tells you what to value: growth or quality, freedom or security, individual reward or collective protection. But the finished structure only gets built by constant, unglamorous adjustment. Prices here, safety nets there, ownership rules somewhere in between. The people who get hurt the most, in every example we covered, are the ones living under systems too proud or too rigid to make that adjustment in time. So if you're waiting for history to declare a final winner between capitalism and socialism, I'd stop waiting, because that's not the contest that was ever actually running. The real contest, the one playing out right now in your own country, is between flexibility and stubbornness, between systems willing to notice they're failing somebody and quietly fix it, and systems too attached to their own theory to look at the evidence in front of them. Cuba, East Germany, Chile, Argentina, Bolivia, Vietnam, Mondragon, Singapore, and Estonia aren't side notes in this story. They're the actual evidence, written by reality instead of theory. And reality, unlike ideology, has never once cared which side of the debate you were rooting for. That's the version of this story I think is worth telling, because it's the one that actually explains why some places thrive and others don't, regardless of which label is printed on their currency. If this changed how you think about the whole debate, stick around. There's a lot more hiding in plain sight in economic history than most explainers ever bother to dig up. The next system that wins won't be the one with the better slogan. It'll be the one that's still willing to admit, 10 years from now, that it got something wrong.